The whimsical world of Weasley's Wizarding Wonders. Chapter 1: The Void Left Behind. The war had ended, but for George Weasley, so had half of his life. Staring into the mirror each morning was a cruel reminder, the reflection showing not just himself, but the ghost of his twin. Fred's absence was an amputation, a phantom limb that still ached even though it was no longer there. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, once the embodiment of their shared dream, stood eerily quiet. The shop's vibrant colors seemed muted, the products less magical, the jokes less funny. Without Fred's laughter echoing off the walls, the place felt hollow. "George, dear, you need to eat something," his mother would say during her daily visits, placing a tray of untouched food next to inventions gathering dust. His family tried, they all did, but their concern only highlighted what he'd lost. Each pitying glance was a reminder that he was now singularly George, no longer one half of Fred and George. The shop remained closed for months after the Battle of Hogwarts. George couldn't bear to reopen without his other half. The thought of standing behind that counter alone felt like betrayal. One rainy afternoon, he found himself in the back room, surrounded by half-finished inventions. Their development journal lay open, the last entry in Fred's handwriting. Idea for everlasting gobstopper, but magical. Changes flavors based on mood. Need to work out the charm combination. George ran his fingers over his brother's scrawl, the ink slightly smudged, where Fred had enthusiastically pressed too hard into the parchment. "How am I supposed to do this without you?" he whispered to the empty room. That night, restless and unable to sleep, George pulled out an old, battered book from his childhood, a Muggle story his father had brought home years ago, fascinated by its ingenious non-magical imagination. George had always loved the tale of the eccentric chocolatier and his fantastic factory. He and Fred had often joked about creating a wizarding version someday. As rain pelted against the windows, George lost himself in the colorful world of Willy Wonka. By dawn, his copy of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory was tear-stained, but had sparked something inside him, the first genuine flicker of inspiration since Fred's death. That day, George opened the shop door just a crack, not to customers, but to possibility. Chapter 2: Seeds of Inspiration. The first breakthrough came 3 weeks later. George had been experimenting with flavor-changing charms combined with mood detection spells, trying to create what Fred had envisioned in his final note. After countless failures, candies that screamed when licked or turned the consumer's tongue into actual taste buds, he finally found the right combination. The metamorphment, as he called it, was a small, iridescent candy that shifted flavors according to the eater's emotional state. Happiness tasted of strawberries and sunshine. Sadness was a bittersweet dark chocolate. Anger burned with cinnamon and chili. It wasn't just a candy, it was emotional validation in edible form. When Ron came to check on him, George silently handed him one. "Bloody hell," Ron exclaimed after a moment, eyes widening. "It tastes like watching the Chudley Cannons finally win the leg." George managed a small smile. "It reflects your feelings. What you're tasting is hope." That evening, George reopened his development journal, flipped to a new page, and began to write. The entry started, "In memory of Fred, the better jokester." Days turned into weeks. George rarely left the workshop, emerging only with smudges of magical residue on his clothes and an increasingly maniacal gleam in his eye. The flat above the shop transformed into a laboratory of sweet chaos, cauldrons bubbling with colorful concoctions, enchanted candy molds dancing across tables, and parchments of calculations and spell modifications covering every surface. Angelina Johnson, who had taken to checking on him regularly, found herself both concerned and impressed. "You're looking alive," she commented one afternoon, watching him frantically scribble notes after a successful test of never-melting ice cream that could be enjoyed in a sauna. "I'm onto something, Aang," George replied, his voice carrying an enthusiasm she hadn't heard in months. "Fred and I always wanted to revolutionize magical confectionery. We got distracted by the joke products because they sold better to Hogwarts students, but this could be different." Angelina picked up what looked like a translucent golden sphere. "What's this one?" "Careful, that's a prototype, floating fizzy lifting drop. Still working out how to control the altitude." George gently took it from her hands. "Had Ron stuck to the ceiling for 3 hours yesterday." As she left that day, Angelina noticed that George had replaced the closed until further notice sign with a new one. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, under miraculous transformation, grand reopening coming soon. For the first time since the funeral, she felt hopeful about George's future. What nobody realized was just how grand and strange that reopening would be. Chapter 3: The Purple Robes. 6 months after Fred's death, George stood before his wardrobe mirror, examining his reflection with critical eyes. The purple velvet coat was perhaps a touch ostentatious, especially with the golden W embroidered on each lapel. The matching top hat might be overkill, but the cane, a gleaming creation of polished oak with a hidden compartment for his wand, that was definitely staying. "What do you think?" he asked the empty room, then caught himself. "Old habits." There was no Fred to answer, to laugh and suggest even more ridiculous additions. For a moment, the weight of absence threatened to crush George's newfound purpose. Then he straightened his shoulders. Too much. Nah, Fred would say it's not enough. With an impish grin that hadn't been seen in months, George added a final touch, a bow tie that flashed different colors and emitted tiny musical notes when tapped with his wand. The invitations had been sent weeks ago, mysterious purple envelopes delivered by owls who disappeared in puffs of scented smoke after dropping their cargo. Inside each envelope was a golden ticket with animated text that read, "You are cordially invited to witness the magnificently magical, stupendously spectacular grand transformation of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes into Weasley's Wizarding Wonders, an emporium of enchanted edibles and fantastical confections. Prepare your taste buds for revolution and your imagination for liberation. May 1st, 1-year anniversary of the victory at Hogwarts. George Weasley, proprietor and chief Imagineer." The choice of date had raised a few concerned eyebrows among his family. The anniversary of the Battle of Hogwarts, of Fred's death, seemed an odd time for celebration, but George was insistent. "It's exactly what Fred would want," he told his mother when she questioned him, turning a day of mourning into something magical. As he made his final preparations on the morning of May 1st, George took a moment to stand in the center of what had once been a joke shop and was now something entirely different. The entire interior had been transformed. Gone were the shelves of skiving snack boxes and bins of trick wands. In their place stood elegant glass cases displaying colorful confections that floated, sparkled, transformed, and defied natural law. A chocolate river, actual liquid chocolate, enchanted to flow continuously, wound its way around the perimeter of the shop, small golden cups bobbing in the current for customers to scoop up tastings. The ceiling had been bewitched to resemble a fantastical candy forest, where rock candy crystals grew alongside lollipop flowers. Miniature working chocolate fountains served as centerpieces for display islands featuring collections like meteorite munchies, candies from beyond this world, and impossible pops, flavors that shouldn't exist but do. Most impressive of all was the great glass elevator in the center of the shop, a transparent capsule attached to no visible mechanism, ready to transport visitors to the upper levels that had been magically expanded to house specialized departments. The bubble room, the inventing room, the nostalgia nook, and several more that remained veiled behind sparkling curtains marked "Coming Soon." As the clock struck noon, George took a deep breath and tapped his cane 3 times on the floor. Throughout the shop, candies began to dance, chocolate frogs started a harmonized croaking song, and the golden lettering above the entrance rearranged itself from Weasley's Wizard Wheezes to Weasley's Wizarding Wonders. With a flourish of his purple coat, George strode to the doors, ready to greet the curious crowd that had gathered outside. But before he turned the sign to open, he paused and whispered, "This one's for you, Freddy." Chapter 4: The Grand Opening. Ladies and gentlemen, witches and wizards, welcome to a place where magic meets imagination and sweetness collides with wonder. George's voice, magically amplified, carried over the crowd that had filled Diagon Alley. The turnout was greater than he had anticipated, not just family and friends, but what seemed like half the wizarding world had shown up, drawn by the mysterious golden tickets and rumors of something revolutionary. He spotted his family in the front, his parents, Bill and Fleur, Charlie who'd come all the way from Romania, Percy looking uncharacteristically relaxed, Ron with Hermione, and Ginny standing with Harry. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to concern to cautious excitement. 1 year ago today, George continued, his voice becoming more solemn, we won a war, but many of us lost pieces of ourselves in the process. His eyes briefly met his mother's, who was clutching Arthur's hand tightly. My other half, my twin, my best friend, Fred Weasley, gave his life so we could stand here freely today. The crowd grew quiet, many heads bowed in remembrance. But Fred would be the first person to turn funeral flowers into squirting daisies. George's voice regained its enthusiasm. He lived for laughter, for mischief, for pushing the boundaries of what magic could do. And so, in his honor, I've created something I believe he would approve of, a place where joy isn't just an emotion, it's edible. With a dramatic sweep of his cane, the doors behind him swung open, releasing a cloud of shimmering, scented smoke that formed the words, Weasley's Wizarding Wonders, before dissolving into a shower of tiny sugar crystals that melted on the tongues of those nearest the entrance. Your golden tickets, please, George called out, and prepare to enter a world of pure imagination and questionable food safety standards. As each guest presented their ticket, George greeted them personally at the door with a handshake that left their palms sparkling with edible glitter. The reactions as people entered were everything he had hoped for: gasps of delight, wide eyes, and exclamations of disbelief. Molly Weasley stood frozen just inside the entrance, tears streaming down her face as she took in the magical wonderland her son had created. "Oh, Georgie," she whispered when he came to her side. It's too much," he asked, suddenly uncertain. "It's exactly what Fred would have wanted," she finished, pulling him into a fierce hug. He would be so proud. The shop quickly filled with excited voices as guests discovered the various marvels. Lee Jordan was floating 3 feet off the ground after sampling a fizzy-lifting Fizbee. Luna Lovegood was delightedly watching her reflection in a mirror munch that showed her with constantly changing fantastical creature features. Even Professor McGonagall, who had arrived looking skeptical, was now sporting a smile as she examined a display of transfiguration truffles that temporarily gave the consumer animal attributes. George moved through the crowd like a maestro, demonstrating products, explaining magical processes, and occasionally using his cane to gently pull back overeager hands from prototypes marked, "Still experimental. Consumer beware." Ron and Harry found him by the chocolate river, where George was showing a group of enthralled children how to summon different flavors by whispering to the golden cups. "This is brilliant, George," Harry said, gesturing around the shop. "Really brilliant." "Thanks, Harry," George grinned. "Care to try a mystery mint? I've enchanted them to taste like your favorite dessert, but with a twist." Ron eyed the innocent-looking green candies suspiciously. "What kind of twist?" "Nothing harmful, might give you frost breath for a few minutes, or your voice might sound like you've inhaled helium, or—" "I'll pass, thanks," Ron interrupted, but he was smiling. "It's good to see you like this again." The comment caught George off guard. "Like what?" "Like yourself," Harry answered, "but also, I don't know, there's something different." George twirled his cane thoughtfully. "Well, I've only got one ear, so that might be it." But as his friends moved on to examine the next wonder, George understood what Harry meant. He did feel different, still missing Fred terribly, but channeling that grief into creation rather than letting it consume him. The shop wasn't just a business, it was a tribute, a coping mechanism, and a new identity all at once. As the afternoon wore on, George gathered everyone in the center of the shop for the main event. With a theatrical tap of his cane, the glass elevator doors opened, and he invited the entire Weasley family to join him inside. "Hold tight," he warned as the doors closed. "This elevator goes sideways and slantways and longways and backways." "And frontways?" asked little Victoire, Bill and Fleur's daughter, her eyes wide with excitement. "And frontways and squareways and any other ways that you can think of," George confirmed, winking at his niece. "Ready, here we go." With no visible mechanism or spell cast, the elevator shot upward, eliciting shrieks of surprise and delight. It paused briefly at each specialized floor, allowing glimpses of wonders still in development, before finally stopping at the topmost level, a beautiful rooftop garden where candy flowers grew alongside real ones and butterflies made of delicate sponge sugar fluttered among the plants. "This," George said more quietly, as his family stepped out into the garden, "is the Memorial Meadow. Every plant here has a connection to someone we lost in the war." He led them to a vibrant patch of orange blossoms. These are rapscallion roses. They look ordinary until you touch them. He demonstrated by gently brushing a finger against a petal, which immediately triggered the flower to shoot a tiny jet of water at his face, then wiggle as if laughing. "Very Fred," George whispered, a sad smile playing on his lips. As the family moved through the garden, George pointed out flowers for Remus and Tonks that changed colors with the phases of the moon, sweet-smelling blooms for lavender brown, sturdy plants with unbreakable stems for Colin Creevy, and many others. In the center of the garden stood a magnificent tree with crystallized sugar leaves that chimed softly in the breeze, creating an ever-changing melody. "The Remembrance Tree," George explained. "Each leaf represents a happy memory of those we've lost. Anyone can add to it by whispering a memory to one of these." He held up what looked like ordinary sugar quills. The memory becomes sweet music for all to enjoy. Molly was the first to take a quill, her hands trembling slightly as she approached the tree. The family watched in respectful silence as she whispered something to the quill, then pressed it against the trunk. A new sugar leaf sprouted, catching the light in a way that made it glow briefly red, the same shade as Fred's hair, before settling into a gentle shimmer. A new note joined the melody, somehow conveying warmth and mischief in a single tone. One by one, each family member added their own memory leaf to the tree. By the time they were finished, the melody had become a complex, beautiful song that seemed to embrace them all in comfort. "This is magic in its purest form, George," Arthur said, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Not just spells and potions, but bringing joy and healing through imagination." As they returned to the main shop floor in the glass elevator, George caught sight of himself reflected in the glass, purple coat, top hat, and a smile that reached his eyes for the first time in a year. For a moment, he thought he saw Fred's reflection alongside his own, nodding in approval. The image vanished as quickly as it had appeared, but the feeling of rightness remained. This wasn't about forgetting Fred or replacing him. It was about honoring him in the most fitting way possible, by creating wonder. Chapter 5: The Chocolate Conundrum. Success came swiftly and overwhelmingly. Within weeks of opening, Weasley's Wizarding Wonders had lines stretching down Diagon Alley. The Daily Prophet ran a feature titled, "From Jokes to Confectionery Genius, George Weasley's Sweet Transformation," and even which weekly got in on the excitement with Purple is the New Black, the eccentric style of Wizarding's newest confectionery icon. George expanded his staff, hearing a team of what he called Wonder Workers, mostly young witches and wizards with backgrounds in both potions and culinary magic. They wore purple waistcoats with golden W's and were trained not just to sell products, but to add to the theatrical experience of the shop. The most popular creations flew off the shelves, everlasting flavor-changing gobstoppers, whether whipped cream that mimicked current conditions, cooling during heat waves, warming during winter, fizzy-lifting drops, wonky vision bonbons that temporarily altered perception, making everything appear upside down or in vivid colors, and memory lane mints that briefly brought back the taste of childhood favorites. But with success came complications. George had always been innovative, but maintaining the expected level of wonder required constant invention. He began spending more and more time in his inventing room, sometimes not emerging for days. The purple coat became rumpled, the bow tie askew, and the theatrical persona of Mr. Weasley, confectionery wizard extraordinaire, started to blend uncomfortably with the real George. 3 months after the grand opening, Angelina found him asleep at his workbench, surrounded by failed experiments and scribbled notes. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his hair, grown longer since Fred's death, stuck out in wild directions. "George," she said softly, placing a cup of tea beside him, "you need to rest properly." He jerked awake, disoriented. "Just 5 more minutes, Fred. I've almost got the formula for," he broke off, reality crashing back as he saw Angelina's concerned face. "Sorry, thought I was somewhere else." Angelina sat beside him, indicating the chaos of the workshop. "This is becoming unhealthy. When was the last time you spent a day not working?" George ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "There's so much demand. Everyone's expecting the next miraculous creation. I need to." "You need to remember that you're human," she interrupted firmly. "Even Willy Wonka must have taken breaks." The comparison made George smile weakly. Actually, in the book, he locked himself away in his factory for years. "And became peculiar as a result," Angelina pointed out. more so than you already are, which is saying something. That afternoon, at Angelina's insistence, George left the shop in the capable hands of his staff and allowed himself to be taken for a broomstick ride over the countryside, something he hadn't done since before the war. The feeling of freedom, of wind rushing past an open sky above, worked magic no spell could replicate. For a few precious hours, he wasn't George Weasley the grieving twin or George Weasley the eccentric shopkeeper, but simply George, enjoying a beautiful day with a beautiful woman. When they landed in a meadow for a picnic Angelina had thoughtfully packed, George felt almost normal again. "I needed this," he admitted, lying back on the blanket to watch clouds drift overhead. "I've been a bit obsessed, haven't I?" Angelina handed him a sandwich that had decidedly non-magical properties. Obsession can be an effective painkiller, but it's not a cure. George was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. "Do you think Fred would approve of what I've done with the shop?" "The magical sweets empire, absolutely," Angelina said without hesitation. "The part where you're working yourself to exhaustion and starting to talk like a character from a children's book, maybe not so much." George chuckled, but there was a note of sadness in it. "Sometimes I feel like I'm becoming someone else entirely. Like George Weasley died with Fred, and this showman in purple is who emerged from the ashes." Angelina's expression softened. "Growing and changing after loss doesn't mean losing yourself, George. It means finding a way forward, but I think even magical candy makers need balance." Their conversation was interrupted by a silvery form materializing beside them, Ron's terrier patronus. "George, you need to come back to the shop immediately," Ron's voice echoed urgently from the patronus. "There's a problem with the latest batch of everlasting gobstoppers. They're eating other candies. It's getting a bit Lord of the Flies in the display cases." George was on his feet instantly, the peaceful afternoon forgotten. "I need to go." Angelina caught his hand. "I'm coming with you. Someone needs to make sure you don't turn this crisis into another 3-day inventing binge." When they arrived at Weasley's Wizarding Wonders, the scene was one of confectionery chaos. The usually orderly displays were in disarray as small, round candies, with surprisingly sharp-looking sugar crystals, were indeed pursuing and consuming other sweets. A chocolate frog, cornered by 3 gobstoppers, croaked pitifully before being engulfed. "What happened?" George demanded of Ron, who was unsuccessfully trying to contain the carnage with freezing charms. "No idea. They were fine this morning, then around noon they started evolving." George approached one of the display cases cautiously. The gobstoppers inside immediately rolled toward the glass, seeming to watch him with an intelligence that candy definitely should not possess. "I think," George said slowly, "I may have accidentally created the first sentient sweets." For the next 24 hours, George worked frantically to develop a countercharm that would revert the gobstoppers to their non-carnivorous state. The shop remained closed, with signs apologizing for the minor magical mishap. Inside, the staff waged a sugary war of containment, armed with magical tongs and protective gloves. It was Angelina who finally identified the problem. "George, when did you last modify the enchantment on these?" 3 nights ago, he answered, rubbing his tired eyes. "I was trying to improve the flavor-changing aspect." "And were you, perhaps, watching anything while you worked, reading anything?" George thought back. "I may have had a Muggle television running in the background. Dad installed it in the workshop so I could study Muggle candy advertising." Angelina raised an eyebrow, and what was playing? Realization dawned on George's face. A nature documentary about predators, you don't think? That your subconscious influenced the enchantment while you were sleep-deprived and distracted seems likely. The fix, once identified, was relatively simple. George created what he called a sugar sedative, a potion that, when sprayed on the rogue gobstoppers, neutralized the accidental enchantment. By evening, the candies were once again inanimate and lacking in carnivorous tendencies. The incident, however, made the front page of the Daily Prophet. W.S.L. Weiss Wild Wonders, Confectionery Calamity in Diagon Alley. Sweet shop shuttered as candies come to life. Rather than damaging the shop's reputation, the story only increased public fascination. When Weasley's Wizarding Wonders reopened 2 days later, the line of customers eager to see the famous shop and perhaps witness another magical mishap, stretched further than ever before. George, still exhausted but now more cautious, addressed the crowd before opening the doors. Gone was the manic energy of previous weeks, replaced by a more measured enthusiasm. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, leaning slightly on his cane, "I want to assure you that all candies inside are now completely safe and under control. Mostly." A ripple of nervous excitement ran through the crowd. In commemoration of our first major magical malfunction, I'm proud to introduce our newest creation, completely non-sentient, I promise Gobstopper Graves. He held up a small tombstone-shaped chocolate with a miniature gobstopper buried inside. Remember the great candy uprising of 2000, a sweet way to memorialize our fallen inventory. The crowd roared with laughter and applause. As they filed into the shop, Angelina stood beside George, shaking her head in amused disbelief. "Only you could turn a disaster into a marketing opportunity," she said. George grinned, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. That's the thing about jokes and sweets, Ang. They're both about transformation, turning pain into pleasure, accidents into opportunities. "And turning grief into purpose?" she asked softly. George's expression turned thoughtful as he watched the excited customers discovering his creations. "That's still a work in progress," he admitted, "but I'm getting there." Chapter 6: The Golden Ticket Contest. A contest? Ron looked skeptical as he helped George unpack a new shipment of sugar butterfly cocoons. Isn't the shop doing well enough already? 6 months had passed since the Gobstopper incident, and Weasley's wizarding wonders had settled into a rhythm of controlled chaos. George had taken Angelina's advice about balance, establishing more regular hours and delegating responsibilities to his growing staff. The purple coat and top hat now hung on a special stand near the entrance, donned only for special occasions and particularly dreary Tuesdays when the world needs extra color. "It's not about attracting more business," George explained, carefully placing a cocoon in a special habitat where in 3 days' time it would hatch into a butterfly made of spun sugar that could actually fly. "It's about creating mystery, adventure." "It's about you being mental," Ron muttered, but there was affection in his voice. George ignored the comment, his expression animated as he outlined his vision. 5 golden tickets hidden in specially marked packages of our new Dreamer's Delight bars. The finders get a private tour of the restricted areas of the shop, including the inventing room, and a lifetime supply of sweets. Restricted areas? You mean the parts that are too experimental to be safe for the general public? Exactly, George beamed. Where's your sense of adventure? Ron rolled his eyes, somewhere between not wanting to be turned into a blueberry and remembering what happened with those gobstoppers. Nevertheless, the Golden Ticket Contest was announced the following week with great fanfare. The Daily Prophet ran the story on its front page, complete with a moving photograph of George in his full purple regalia, dramatically revealing one of the golden tickets before hiding it in a chocolate bar with a mischievous wink. WSLEY's wonderful contest. 5 golden chances at sweet SECRETS. Eccentric confectioner offers unprecedented access to magical candy kingdom. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Lines formed outside Weasley's Wizarding Wonders before dawn each day, with eager customers purchasing Dreamer's Delight bars by the armful. The special chocolate, which induced a brief, pleasant daydream unique to each consumer while melting on the tongue, became an overnight sensation, even without the added incentive of the contest. To everyone's surprise, the first golden ticket was found just 2 days after the contest began. 10-year-old Timothy Whittaker, the son of a Muggle father and witch mother, discovered it while sharing a Dreamer's Delight with his parents in their home in Bath. The second ticket was found by Mathilda Greengrass, an elderly witch from a prominent pureblood family who declared herself far too old for such nonsense, but was seen giggling like a schoolgirl when she presented her ticket at the shop. The third went to Omar Hussing, a talented young wizard who worked as an apprentice potioneer and had purchased the chocolate bar on his lunch break. The fourth was claimed by none other than Luna Lovegood, who dreamily announced that she'd been directed to that particular bar by a Nargle. As the weeks passed and the supply of Dreamer's Delight bars dwindled, anticipation grew for the 5th and final ticket. Speculation ran wild about whether it had already been found, and the finder was keeping quiet, or whether it was still out there waiting to be discovered. George maintained an air of mystery, refusing to confirm or deny any rumors. In truth, the fifth ticket had indeed been found by Angelina Johnson, who had purchased a bar on her way to Quidditch practice and nearly fallen off her broom in shock when the golden ticket fluttered out. She had kept her discovery secret at George's request, partly to maintain the suspense, and partly because her inclusion had sparked rumors about their relationship that neither was quite ready to address publicly. On the morning of the tour, George stood before the 4 known ticket winners, dressed in his finest purple coat, twirling his cane with flourish. "Welcome, lucky finders," he greeted them, his voice carrying the theatrical quality he reserved for special occasions. "Today you will see confectionery magic that few outside this building have ever witnessed. You will taste sweets still in the experimental stage. You will experience wonders that may delight, astound, or possibly mildly nauseate you." Timothy Whittaker's eyes were as wide as saucers. "Will there be chocolate?" the boy asked in an awed whisper. George knelt down to the child's level, his expression serious. "More chocolate than you have ever imagined, young Timothy. Chocolate that listens to your dreams. Chocolate that can make you invisible, temporarily of course. We're still working out that particular bug." He straightened up, addressing the group. "But before we begin, I must introduce you to our mysterious fifth ticket holder." On cue, Angelina stepped through the door, golden ticket in hand, and a slightly embarrassed smile on her face. "Miss Angelina Johnson," George announced grandly, "former Gryffindor chaser extraordinaire, current professional Quidditch player for the Montrose Magpies, and," he paused dramatically, "my special guest." Luna tilted her head curiously. "I thought you two were dating." George's theatrical persona faltered momentarily as he and Angelina exchanged a look. Their relationship had been developing slowly, carefully, both mindful of Fred's memory and the complex emotions involved. "We're friends," Angelina said diplomatically. "With certain benefits," George added with a wink that made Angelina roll her eyes. Recovering quickly, George clapped his hands together. "Now, the tour awaits. Please keep your hands, feet, and wands inside the designated safe zones at all times. Weasley's Wizarding Wonders accepts no liability for spontaneous transformations, temporary elevations, chromatic alterations to skin tone, or sudden development of unusual cravings." With that, he led the group toward the glass elevator, which had been decorated with golden streamers for the occasion. As they crowded inside, George pressed a button labeled simply Beyond, and the elevator shot sideways rather than up or down, passing through what appeared to be a solid wall into a hidden section of the shop. "First stop," George announced as the doors opened, the bubble room. The chamber before them was vast, much larger than should have been possible given the shop's exterior dimensions. The air was filled with bubbles of all sizes, from tiny orbs no bigger than peas to enormous spheres large enough to contain a person. Each bubble shimmered with a different color and emitted a faint, pleasant scent. "Everlasting bubbles," George explained, catching a small pink one on his finger. "Each contains a different experience. Some are flavors, try the blue ones for a taste of the ocean without the salt water up your nose. Others are sensations, the gold ones make you feel like you're flying. And a select few," he pointed to some dark purple bubbles floating near the ceiling, "contain memories." "Memories?" Omar asked, his potioneer training clearly peaked. "Like a pensive." "Similar principle, different execution," George confirmed. "These are specifically engineered happy memories, not mine or anyone else's personal recollections, but magically constructed perfect moments. A sunset on a perfect day, the feeling of diving into cool water on a hot summer afternoon, the satisfaction of finding the last puzzle piece." He demonstrated by gently catching one of the purple bubbles and holding it up to his face. As it popped against his skin, George's expression transformed to one of pure delight, his eyes closing momentarily as he experienced whatever memory the bubble contained. "Go on," he encouraged the others. "Find one that calls to you." Timothy was the first to act, jumping excitedly to catch a bubble twice the size of his head. When it burst, the boy's face lit up with wonder. "I was riding a dragon," he exclaimed. "It felt so real." One by one, the others tried different bubbles, each experiencing something uniquely joyful. Luna drifted dreamily after popping a silvery bubble, murmuring about dirigible plums and dancing with her father. Omar became intensely curious, methodically testing bubbles of different colors and taking notes on their effects. Only Mathilda Greengrass hesitated, eyeing the floating spheres with aristocratic suspicion. "Not fond of bubbles, Mrs. Greengrass?" George asked gently. The elderly witch sniffed. "At my age, Mr. Weasley, one is cautious about artificial happiness." George considered her for a moment, then reached high with his cane to tap a particularly luminous gold bubble down to her level. "This one, I think," he said, "tailored for those with discerning taste." Somewhat reluctantly, Mathilda allowed the bubble to touch her hand. The moment it burst, her severe expression melted away, replaced by a soft, surprised smile. "My first dance," she whispered. "How did you know?" George merely winked, tapping his ear, the one he still had, as if to say it was a secret. After allowing his guests to enjoy the bubble room thoroughly, George herded them back into the glass elevator. "Next stop," he announced, pressing a button labeled with what appeared to be a question mark, the confoundery. The elevator shot upward, then did a complete loop-de-loop before coming to a gentle stop. The doors opened onto a room that seemed to defy the laws of both physics and common sense. Staircases led to nowhere, doors were placed in the middle of the floor, and what appeared to be windows showed impossible vistas, underwater kingdoms, and alien landscapes. "Welcome to the confoundery," George said proudly, stepping out, "where confusion is confection and nothing is quite what it seems." The room was filled with treats that played tricks on the senses, candies that tasted like one thing but looked like another, chocolates that made you temporarily speak backward, toffees that inverted your sense of direction. "Try these," George offered, holding out a tray of what appeared to be ordinary mints, perspective pastilles. "They give you someone else's point of view, literally, for about 60 seconds. Omar took one cautiously. The moment he put it in his mouth, his eyes widened. "I'm seeing from across the room. I can see the back of my own head." Indeed, Omar was now seeing through Timothy's eyes, while the boy giggled in delight at suddenly viewing the world from adult height. Luna, who had taken a blue pastille, seemed unfazed. "Oh, I'm seeing through Mathilda's eyes. How interesting. You have a very different aura palette than I expected, Mrs. Greengrass." The elderly witch, meanwhile, was looking around with Luna's characteristic wide-eyed wonder. "Is this how you see the world all the time, Miss Lovegood? It's rather beautiful." George watched these interactions with satisfaction. The confoundery was designed not just for sensory confusion, but for something deeper, empathy, walking in another's shoes, quite literally. Angelina sidled up beside him as the guests continued exploring. "You've put a lot of thought into this, haven't you? It's not just about sweets." George nodded, his voice quieter than usual. "Fred and I always wanted to make people laugh, but after everything that happened, I wanted something more, something that might help heal, not just distract." Angelina's hand found his, their fingers intertwining naturally. "You're doing exactly that." The next stop on the tour was the chamber George referred to with reverent excitement as the inventing room. As the elevator doors opened, clouds of colorful steam billowed out, carrying scents that ranged from deliciously mouth-watering to decidedly strange. "Now," George said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "what you are about to see is the very heart of Weasley's Wizarding Wonders, the birthplace of every magical treat, my personal laboratory of confectionery creation." The room was a magnificent chaos of bubbling cauldrons, spinning contraptions, magical instruments, and containers filled with ingredients ranging from the mundane to the extraordinary. Wonder workers in their purple waistcoats moved purposefully through the steam, measuring, mixing, and testing various concoctions. "Please explore, touch nothing without permission, taste only what is offered," George instructed, spinning his cane with infectious enthusiasm, "and prepare to witness magic in its sweetest form." Chapter 7: The Inventing Room. The inventing room was a symphony of sounds, smells, and motion. Cauldrons bubbled and burbled, magical mixers whirred, candy molds danced through the air, and wonder workers navigated the organized chaos with practiced precision. "This," George said, leading his guests to a central workstation, "is where the real magic happens." Timothy's eyes were round as galleons as he took in the fantastical laboratory. "It's better than I imagined," the boy breathed. "Imagination is the key ingredient in everything we create here," George replied with a wink. That, and a healthy disregard for conventional magical limitations. He directed their attention to a golden cauldron at the center of the room, where a shimmering silver liquid bubbled gently. This is our newest creation in progress. We're calling it Liquid Luck Licorice, not actual Felix Felicis, mind you, that would be highly regulated, but a sweet that gives you a brief sense of everything going right, the feeling of luck without the magical compulsion. Omar leaned forward with professional interest. How are you achieving the psychological effect without the actual potion? George smiled mysteriously. Trade secret, my good man, but I'll give you a hint. It involves synchronized cheering charms bound to a release mechanism in the candy base. As they moved through the room, George introduced them to various stations and the wonder workers managing them. There was the everlasting ice cream section, where treats were being charmed to maintain perfect temperature regardless of weather. The taste testers corner, where brave volunteers sampled experimental flavors. Currently, a young witch was experiencing what appeared to be an underwater symphony, complete with bubble effects emanating from her ears. The tour paused at a particularly unusual setup, featuring what looked like miniature thunderclouds contained in glass spheres. Weather willies, George explained proudly. Hard candies that create a tiny weather phenomenon in your mouth. Fancy a refreshing spring shower, a crisp winter snowfall, or perhaps, he waggled his eyebrows dramatically, a thunderstorm of taste. Isn't that dangerous? Mathilda asked, eyeing the tiny lightning bolts with suspicion. Absolutely not, George assured her. Then after a beat, well, minimal danger, microscopic risk. The tingling sensation only lasts a few hours. Before Mathilda could further question the safety standards, George smoothly directed the group to another station. And here we have our newest line of sensory-shifting sweets, the Synesthesia series. This display featured elegant bonbons arranged by color. These allow you to temporarily experience one sense through another, taste colors, see sounds, feel flavors, one of our most popular experiences. Luna immediately picked up a swirling purple and blue chocolate. May I? George nodded. That one should let you see music as color. Luna popped it into her mouth, and her already protuberant eyes widened further. As George hummed a few notes, she gasped in delight. Oh, it's like ribbons of light. The lower notes are deep blue, and the higher ones are like golden sparkles. The other guests, seeing Luna's reaction, eagerly tried different varieties. Soon Timothy was laughing as he tasted the color red, like cinnamon and strawberries. Omar was fascinated by feeling scents as textures, and even Mathilda seemed delightfully perplexed by hearing flavors as musical notes. Throughout it all, George played the perfect host, part showman, part mad scientist, part tour guide. He explained processes, demonstrated effects, and shared the inspiration behind various creations. But Angelina noticed something more beneath the performance: genuine passion. This wasn't just Fred's brother carrying on their legacy. This was George Weasley finding his own path through invention and wonder. The final demonstration in the inventing room was the most spectacular. George led them to a cordoned-off area where a massive contraption of brass, glass, and magical components hummed with energy. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced with theatrical gravity, I present the culmination of 6 months of intensive experimental magic, the Wonderizer. The machine resembled a cross between a Victorian steam engine and an elaborate telescope, with dozens of dials, levers, and magical measuring instruments attached to various parts. At its base was a collection chamber filled with what looked like ordinary sugar. This magnificent device, George continued, patting the machine affectionately, can extract the pure essence of wonder from experiences and infuse it into confectionery form. The process is extraordinarily complex, involving memory extraction techniques similar to those used in pensive creation, combined with advanced flavor-fixing charms and temporal experience compression. Omar's professional curiosity was clearly piqued. You're saying you can capture an emotional experience and make it consumable. Precisely, George confirmed. Think of it as bottling a perfect moment, the awe of seeing your first unicorn, the thrill of your first broom flight, the joy of finding a galleon you thought you'd lost. He gestured to several wonder workers who stood ready at different stations around the machine. To demonstrate, my colleagues have volunteered some of their own wonderful memories. With a dramatic flourish of his cane, George signaled for the demonstration to begin. The Wonder workers each pointed their wands to their temples, extracting silvery strands of memory similar to those used in pensives. Instead of placing these in a basin, however, they directed them into a collection chamber at the top of the Wonderizer. The machine hummed louder, its components whirring and spinning. Magical gauges flickered, and the various tubes began to glow with colors that shifted from silver to gold to a spectrum of bright hues. Steam puffed from release valves in rhythmic bursts as the memories were processed through the elaborate system. Finally, the sugar in the collection chamber began to sparkle and transform, taking on an iridescent quality that seemed to change depending on the angle from which it was viewed. Voila, George proclaimed as the machine completed its cycle. Wonder sugar, the key ingredient in our most magical creations. He carefully collected a small amount of the processed sugar into a glass vial and held it up for inspection. Within the crystals, tiny scenes seemed to play out, glimpses of the memories that had been used to create it. "Would anyone like to try?" George offered. Timothy's hand shot up immediately. "Me, please, me." George smiled and handed the boy a tiny spoon with a few grains of the Wonder sugar. "Just a taste, it's quite potent." As soon as the sugar touched Timothy's tongue, his expression transformed into one of pure amazement. His eyes widened, and for a moment, he seemed to be seeing something beyond the room. "I'm flying," he whispered, "over a forest, and there are unicorns running below, and everything feels magical." One by one, the others sampled the Wonder sugar, each experiencing a different manifestation of the concentrated wonder it contained. Luna floated in dreamy contentment. Omar looked as though he'd just solved a particularly complex theoretical problem. Mathilda's aged face softened with remembered joy. When it was Angelina's turn, she caught George watching her closely as she tasted the sugar. The moment it dissolved on her tongue, she was filled with a familiar sensation, the exhilaration of her first successful Quidditch match, combined with something else, something newer, the feeling she got whenever George looked at her the way he was looking at her right now. Their eyes met and an unspoken understanding passed between them. This, the wonder, the joy, the magic, was more than a business. It was George's way of processing grief, of honoring Fred, and of finding a path forward. As the effects of the Wonder sugar faded, George clapped his hands together. "And now, my esteemed guests, we come to the final and perhaps most meaningful stop on our tour. If you would all return to the elevator, we have one last wonder to share." The glass elevator carried them upward once more, past floors labeled Development Den, Taste Testing Terrace, and Prototype Playground, until finally stopping at the very top of the building. As the doors opened, Timothy gasped audibly, and even the adults fell silent in appreciation. They had arrived at the Memorial Meadow, the rooftop garden George had previously shared only with his family. In the months since that first unveiling, the garden had flourished beyond imagination. Candy flowers grew alongside real ones in harmonious arrangements. The sugar leaf remembrance tree at the center had grown massive, its crystalline foliage creating a symphony of chiming notes in the gentle breeze. "This," George said, his showman's persona softening into something more genuine, "is the true heart of Weasley's wizarding wonders. Not the inventions or the sales, but the remembrance and celebration of those who brought magic into our lives." He led them along winding paths where placards described each magical plant and its significance. The rapscallion roses for Fred, the moonlight-sensitive blooms for Remus and Tonks, the unbreakable flowers for Colin Creevey, and dozens more, each commemorating someone lost in the war against Voldemort. "Every sweet we create," George explained, "carries a small portion of the wonder these brave witches and wizards brought to the world. Their memory infuses everything we do here." He handed each guest a sugar quill of the type used to add memories to the remembrance tree. "If you wish, you may contribute your own memory of wonder to our collection, not necessarily of those we've lost. Any moment of magic or joy in your life that you'd like to preserve in sweetness." One by one, they approached the tree. Timothy whispered to his quill about the day he first showed signs of magic, making his muggle father's newspaper fly around the room. Luna contributed a memory of an expedition with her father where they'd almost spotted a crumplehorn snorkack. Omar shared the moment he successfully brewed his first potion. Mathilda, after some hesitation, offered what she later told them was the memory of dancing at her 100th birthday celebration the previous year. Angelina went last, whispering something to her quill that made the newly formed leaf glow a particularly vibrant shade of red gold. When George raised an eyebrow in question, she simply smiled and said, "That's between me and the tree." As the tour concluded and they returned to the main shop floor, George presented each guest with an ornate purple box tied with a golden ribbon. "Your lifetime supply of Weasley's Wizarding Wonders," he explained, "begins with these special selections. Each box has been personalized based on what I've observed of your preferences today." Indeed, when opened, each package contained a different assortment. Timothy's was filled with adventurous treats that promised extraordinary experiences. Luna received an assortment focused on perception-altering sweets that complemented her already unique worldview. Omar's collection included comprehensive notes on the magical theory behind various candies, sure to satisfy his potioneer's curiosity. Mathilda's elegant box contained refined, subtly magical confections that would impress even the most discerning pureblood dinner guests. Additionally, George continued, you'll receive monthly deliveries of new creations before they're available to the general public. You are now honorary wonder workers, taste testers, and ambassadors for the magic of sweetness. As the guests exclaimed over their gifts and began to disperse, Angelina approached George, who was leaning slightly on his cane, the exertion of the extended performance finally showing in his posture. "You haven't looked at your special selection," he said, nodding to the purple box she held. Inside, Angelina found not an assortment of sweets, but a single golden key with a tag attached that read simply, "For after hours." She looked up questioningly. "The shop can be quite magical when it's empty," George explained, a hint of uncertainty behind his usual confidence. "I thought perhaps you might like to see it sometime, just the two of us." Angelina smiled, tucking the key carefully into her pocket. "I'd like that very much." As they watched the last of the golden ticket winners depart, Angelina noticed George's expression growing more contemplative, his theatrical energy fading into something more vulnerable. "What is it?" she asked softly. George ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that momentarily made him look more like the boy she'd known at Hogwarts than the elaborate character he'd become. "Do you think he'd be proud?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Fred, do you think he'd understand what I've done with our shop?" Angelina considered the question carefully, knowing how much the answer meant. "I think," she said finally, "that Fred would be gobsmacked by what you've created. He'd be jealous he didn't think of it first, proud that you had the courage to transform your shared vision into something new, and absolutely determined to create the most outrageous candy concepts possible to challenge you." A genuine smile spread across George's face. "You're right. He'd be coming up with increasingly ridiculous ideas just to see if I could make them work. Exploding chocolates that reassemble themselves for a second surprise. Sweets that make you temporarily speak in rhyme. Candies that turn your bogies into butterflies." They were both laughing now, the tension broken. George straightened up, restored by the moment of shared remembrance. "You know," he said, twirling his cane thoughtfully, "those are actually brilliant ideas." Chapter 8, After Hours. The shop was transformed in darkness. Moonlight filtered through the enchanted ceiling, casting rippling patterns across the now quiet displays. The chocolate river flowed silently, its surface glossy and still without the day's excitement to disturb it. Display cases glowed with a soft, pulsing light, illuminating candies that seemed to sleep until the morning rush. George guided Angelina through the main floor, his purple coat traded for more casual robes. Though he still carried the cane, it had become as much a part of him as his missing ear. "It's peaceful," Angelina remarked, her voice naturally lowering to match the hushed atmosphere. "This is when I do my best thinking," George admitted. "After everyone's gone, when it's just me and," he gestured vaguely around the shop, "all this possibility." He led her to the chocolate river, where he conjured comfortable chairs on a small platform that floated gently onto the liquid surface. As they settled in, golden cups bobbed up from the chocolate, filled to the brim. "Midnight tasting," George explained, offering her a cup. "The chocolate behaves differently after dark. More contemplative flavors emerge." Angelina took a sip and found he was right. The chocolate was deeper, richer, with notes of something almost like starlight, if starlight had a flavor. When did you become so poetic about sweets? She asked, amused but impressed. George chuckled, somewhere between the third and fourth explosion in the inventing room. There's something about having your eyebrows singed off repeatedly that makes a man philosophical. Their floating platform drifted lazily along the river's course, occasionally passing under candy archways or beside displays that activated in subtle ways as they passed, sugar butterflies fluttering briefly before settling again, chocolate frogs giving sleepy croaks, pepper imps exhaling tiny puffs of flame in what almost resembled snores. The shop has its own personality at night, George said, like it's dreaming. They were quiet for a moment, enjoying the peaceful journey and each other's company. The past year had changed them both, George most visibly, but Angelina too had been shaped by loss and recovery. Their relationship had evolved gradually, built on shared grief transformed slowly into shared joy. I have something to show you, George said finally, guiding their platform back to solid ground. Something I haven't shown anyone, not even family. Curious, Angelina followed him to the glass elevator. Instead of pressing any of the labeled buttons, George tapped his wand in a complicated pattern against the control panel. The elevator responded with a soft chime and began to descend, passing below the main floor into depths Angelina hadn't known existed. When the doors opened, they stood at the entrance to a small, intimate workshop that was notably different from the chaotic inventing room above. Where that space was all theatrical steam and bubbling concoctions, this room was methodical, personal, and clearly George's private sanctuary. The walls were lined with photographs, Fred and George through the years, from toddlerhood to their final days at Hogwarts together. Their first experiments, their proudest moments, their most spectacular disasters. One section was dedicated entirely to product development, with detailed notes in both Fred's and George's handwriting, charting the evolution of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes from concept to reality. At the center of the room stood a workbench with a single cauldron, several notebooks, and what appeared to be a pensive, though smaller than the standard version and tinted slightly purple. This is where it all really happens, George said softly. The inventing room upstairs is partly for show, controlled chaos for the benefit of visitors. But this is where Fred and I started and where I come to remember. Angelina approached the workbench with reverence, understanding the significance of being allowed into this space. A memory pensive, she asked, indicating the basin. Similar but modified, it doesn't just store memories, it distills them into their emotional essence. George ran a finger along the pensive's rim. It's how I create the most meaningful candies, by capturing the feeling of a moment, not just the visual memory. He hesitated, then added, it's also how I talk to Fred. Angelina looked at him questioningly. Not literally, George clarified. I'm not delusional, but when I place a memory of us working together in here, I can extract the Fredness of it, his approach to problems, his perspective. It helps me think like we used to think together. He reached for a small vial beside the pensive. Inside was a swirling substance, not quite liquid or gas, glowing with a bright, mischievous energy that was unmistakably reminiscent of Fred Weasley. This was from our first successful prototype of the skiving snack box, George explained. The moment when we realized we might actually pull off this mad dream of a joke shop. I distilled it down to pure essence of inspiration and used it to create the wonder sugar you tasted today. Angelina was deeply moved by the intimacy of what George was sharing. This wasn't the showman in purple she'd watched entertain crowds, nor the grieving brother who had shut himself away after the battle. This was George finding his way forward while honoring what came before. Would you, George paused, suddenly uncertain, would you like to see how it works? At Angelina's nod, he carefully decanted a memory into the pensive, a silvery strand that Angelina recognized as his own. As it made contact with the purple-tinted surface, the memory began to play above the basin like a three-dimensional projection. It was George and Fred, perhaps 15 or 16 years old, huddled in what appeared to be the Gryffindor common room late at night. They were whispering excitedly over a parchment covered in diagrams of what would eventually become their wildfire whiz-bangs. The memory was filled with their infectious enthusiasm, their seamless communication as they finished each other's sentences and built on each other's ideas. Now watch, George said softly, tapping the pensive with his wand. The memory began to shift, the visual elements fading while the emotional content intensified. The essence of innovation, collaboration, and brotherly connection distilled into a glowing essence that rose from the pensive in spiraling patterns. With practiced movements, George guided this essence into a waiting crystal vial. "This becomes the soul of a new creation," he explained. "The magic that makes our products more than just clever spellwork or potion craft, it gives them heart." Angelina watched in amazement. George, this is extraordinary magic. I've never seen anything like it." "It started as a way to hold on to Fred," George admitted, his voice vulnerable in a way it rarely was anymore. "But it's become something more, a way to share joy and wonder with others, a way to transform grief into something beautiful." The intimacy of the moment hung between them. George had shared not just his creative process, but the very core of how he had survived his twin's death. It was a level of trust that went beyond their casual mentions of dating or their comfortable flirtation. Angelina reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "Thank you for showing me this." George's eyes met hers, and for a moment, the showman, the inventor, the grieving brother all fell away, leaving just George, vulnerable, hopeful, and very much alive. "There's one more thing I'd like to show you," he said, reaching for another crystal vial on the shelf. This one contained an essence that glowed with a warm, rich gold color. "This is what I've been working on privately, a new kind of confection, one that doesn't create an experience but honors one that already exists." He carefully poured the essence into a small mold shaped like a heart, then tapped it with his wand. The liquid solidified into a perfect, golden candy heart that seemed to pulse with gentle light. "I call it a memory sweet," George explained, offering it to Angelina. "It doesn't create artificial feelings or amusing effects. It simply reminds you of something already in your heart." Angelina looked at the small candy resting on her palm, then at George, understanding dawning in her eyes. "What memory did you use for this?" "The first Quidditch practice after the war," George said softly. "When you told me to get back on my broom because Fred would hunt me down in the afterlife if I quit the game we both loved. When you refused to treat me like I was broken." He swallowed hard. "The first time I laughed, really laughed, after losing him." Angelina remembered that day clearly. George showing up to the makeshift Quidditch pitch looking lost, everyone else walking on eggshells around him, and her own impatience with the situation leading to her tossing him his old beater's bat and challenging him to hit a bludger if he could still remember how. With a small smile, she placed the memory sweet on her tongue. As it dissolved, she wasn't overwhelmed by artificial euphoria or magical effects. Instead, she simply felt a warm certainty, a recognition of something that had been growing between them since that day on the Quidditch pitch. Something real, built on shared history, mutual understanding, and genuine caring. When she looked up at George again, his expression was questioning, vulnerable. Without words, she leaned forward and kissed him, not their first kiss, but perhaps their most honest one, without performance or pretense on either side. "I think," she said when they finally parted, "that Weasley's Wizarding Wonders has achieved its greatest creation yet." "The memory sweet?" George asked. Angelina shook her head, smiling. "No, you, the man who found a way to transform grief into wonder without losing himself in the process." Chapter 9, The Anniversary Spectacular. 1 year after the grand opening of Weasley's Wizarding Wonders, Diagon Alley was transformed. Purple and gold banners hung from every lamppost. Enchanted fireworks, more sophisticated versions of the wildfire whiz-bangs, performed elaborate aerial ballets in the daylight sky. The line of customers waiting to enter the shop stretched around the corner, many wearing purple top hats in homage to the now famous proprietor. The Anniversary Spectacular had been advertised for weeks. Special edition candies had been released in the lead-up, each more magical than the last. Rumors swirled about what George Weasley, now known throughout the wizarding world as much for his theatrical persona as for his magical confections, would unveil on this momentous occasion. Inside the shop, George stood before the mirror in his private quarters, adjusting his purple coat, this one even more elaborate than the original, with animated golden W's that danced across the fabric and tiny enchanted candy pieces embroidered along the lapels. His bow tie played a jaunty tune when tapped, and his top hat was lined with compartments containing several emergency sweets, just in case. "Fred would say I look ridiculous," George told his reflection, then smiled, "and he'd be absolutely right." There was a knock at the door, and Angelina entered, dressed in her own purple outfit, more understated than George's but clearly marking her as part of the Wonders team. Over the past year, she had become not just George's partner in life, but an integral part of the business, bringing her athletes' discipline and strategic mind to help manage the rapidly expanding empire. "Ready?" she asked, straightening his bow tie. "The family's all here, and the crowd outside is getting restless with anticipation. I think someone may have slipped them some anticipation amplifier all sorts." George grinned mischievously. "Might have arranged that. Builds the excitement." He took a deep breath, centering himself for the performance ahead. The anniversary spectacular wasn't just a business celebration, it was personal. 2 years since Fred's death, 1 year since George had transformed their joke shop into something new, a milestone worth marking properly. "Let's give them a show they'll never forget," he said, offering Angelina his arm. The main floor of the shop had been reconfigured for the event. The displays had been moved to create a central stage area where George would make his presentation. The chocolate river now flowed in a circle around this stage, and the ceiling had been enchanted to shower down edible golden stars at dramatic moments. George's family occupied the front row of seats, Molly and Arthur looking proud if slightly bemused by the spectacle their son had created, Bill and Fleur with Victoire, who was bouncing in excitement, Charlie, who had once again made the journey from Romania, Percy attempting to maintain dignity despite wearing a purple top hat, Ron and Hermione holding hands, and Ginny with Harry, both smiling in anticipation. Behind them sat the shop staff, the wonder workers who had helped bring George's vision to life, and behind them, the lucky customers who had secured tickets to the indoor portion of the event. Those who couldn't fit inside would watch via magical projection screens set up throughout Diagon Alley. At precisely noon, the lights dimmed, and a spotlight illuminated the empty stage. With a dramatic puff of purple smoke, George appeared, twirling his cane and beaming at the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, witches and wizards, children of all ages," he announced, his voice magically amplified. "Welcome to the 1-year anniversary of Weasley's Wizarding Wonders." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers. "1 year ago today," George continued, "we opened our doors and invited you into a world where confectionery and magic unite to create pure wonder. Since then, we've served over 100,000 customers, created 73 new magical treats, had 22 minor magical mishaps, and 1 major incident with those carnivorous gobstoppers that we don't talk about." Laughter rippled through the audience. "Today, we celebrate not just our success, but the magic that brings us all together, the wonder that survived a war, the joy that persists even when we've lost those most dear to us." George's theatrical persona softened momentarily as he looked directly at his family. 2 years ago, we lost my twin brother, Fred Weasley. Some of you knew him as the more handsome, slightly funnier half of the Weasley twins. There were soft chuckles and a few sniffles from the audience. Fred lived for laughter and mischief. He believed magic should bring joy, and while I can never fill the void his absence left in our world, I've tried to honor his spirit by creating something that would make him proud. George's voice caught slightly before he regained his composure. Something that would make him jealous he didn't think of at first. This earned a genuine laugh from his family, who knew just how competitive the twins had always been. "So today," George continued, twirling his cane with renewed energy, "we not only celebrate our first year of Weasley's Wizarding Wonders, but we also unveil our most magical creation yet." With a dramatic sweep of his arm, George directed attention to a large object in the center of the stage, covered by a purple velvet cloth. With a tap of his cane, the cloth vanished in a shower of golden sparks, revealing what appeared to be an ordinary-looking door frame standing independently on the stage. The crowd murmured in confusion. "Ladies and gentlemen," George announced, his voice rising with theatrical excitement, "I present to you the Daydream Door." He approached the door, which was painted a bright purple with a golden doorknob. How many of you have enjoyed our patented Daydream charms over the years? A 30-minute escape into a perfectly crafted fantasy. Many hands went up. The Daydream charms had been one of Weasley's Wizard Wheez's most popular products. "Well, prepare to be amazed," George declared. "The Daydream Door takes that concept to an entirely new level. Step through this doorway, and you'll enter a fully realized wonderland where every sweet ever imagined exists, where magical confections roam wild, where chocolate rivers flow through candy forests, and where the air itself tastes of your favorite flavor. He paused for dramatic effect. The experience lasts precisely 10 minutes in real time, though it will feel much longer to the participants, and is completely safe for all ages. No side effects except perhaps a temporary craving for something sweet. The crowd was buzzing with excitement now. Magical doorways to fantastical realms were the stuff of legends and fairy tales, not commercial products. And who better to be our first official visitors, George continued, than the people who made all of this possible, my family, who supported me even when they thought I might be going round the bend. He gestured grandly to the front row, inviting the Weasleys forward. Molly looked slightly apprehensive, Arthur excited, and the siblings exchanged curious glances as they made their way to the stage. Together, George said, his hand on the doorknob, let's step into pure imagination. As he turned the knob and swung the door open, a dazzling golden light spilled out. George led his family through, and as the last of them stepped across the threshold, the door closed behind them. The audience waited with bated breath. On a large mirror that had appeared above the door, they could see what the Weasley family was experiencing, a spectacular landscape made entirely of sweets. Mountains of ice cream that never melted, trees with candy leaves and chocolate trunks, flowers made of spun sugar that changed flavor when picked, and creatures, magical confectionery constructs that hopped, flew, and swam through the fantastical environment. The crowd gasped and applauded as they watched the family's adventure unfold on the mirror. Molly's initial apprehension quickly gave way to delight as she discovered a garden of crystallized flowers that played her favorite songs when touched. Arthur was thoroughly fascinated by a chocolate contraption that resembled a Muggle automobile but ran on fizzy energy. The siblings scattered to explore different areas. Bill and Charlie raced candy constructs that resembled dragons. Percy examined a library with books made of flavored paper, and Ron discovered a chess set with pieces that tasted different depending on their strategic position. 10 minutes later, the door swung open once more, and the Weasley family emerged, looking slightly dazed but thoroughly delighted. Molly's eyes were wet with tears of joy, and even Percy looked uncharacteristically disheveled with sugar crystals in his usually impeccable hair. Well, George asked the audience, spinning his cane triumphantly, who would like to be next? The response was thunderous. Everyone wanted to experience the Daydream Door. Ah, but here's the wonderful news, George announced over the excited clamor. Starting today, we will be installing Daydream Doors in select locations throughout Wizarding Britain. Hogsmeade, Edinburgh, Manchester, Cardiff, and London will each host a door, with more locations to come. For a small fee, with proceeds supporting war orphans through the Fred Weasley Memorial Foundation, anyone can experience the wonder for themselves. The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause. George had not only created something magical, he had found a way to share it widely while honoring Fred's memory in a meaningful way. As the demonstration continued with selected audience members taking their turns through the door, Angelina joined George at the side of the stage. "The doors are a stroke of genius," she said softly. "How did you solve the spatial extension problems?" George grinned. "Remember those weekends I disappeared to consult with Flitwick and McGonagall? Turns out, if you combine extension charms with memory extraction techniques and add a pinch of time-turner theory, don't worry, it doesn't actually affect time, just the perception of it. You can create a pocket dimension that exists only as long as someone is experiencing it." "It's brilliant," Angelina said, squeezing his hand proudly. Fred would have been furious he didn't think of it first, George finished, his expression soft, but then he'd have immediately started thinking of improvements. When the demonstrations concluded, George returned to center stage for the finale of the anniversary spectacular. "Before we end today's celebrations," he announced, "I have one more surprise." With a wave of his wand, small purple boxes appeared, floating down from the ceiling to land in the lap of each audience member. Commemorate today with a very special creation, Memory Sweets. Each contains the essence of a perfect moment from our first year. When consumed, they'll share with you the joy, wonder, and sometimes the chaos that goes into creating magical confections. A little taste of Weasley's wizarding wonders to take home with you. As the audience opened their boxes to discover the golden, heart-shaped candies inside, George made one final announcement. And now, to conclude our celebration in proper Weasley fashion. He tapped his cane 3 times on the stage floor. Immediately, the enchanted ceiling released not just the promised golden stars, but a spectacular display of wildfire whiz-bangs that erupted throughout the shop. Unlike the original versions, these were edible. As they exploded into colorful patterns, they transformed into a sweet, flavored mist that gently rained down on the delighted audience. To wonder, George proclaimed, raising his cane high, to magic, to sweetness, and to Fred Weasley, who would have turned this into an even bigger spectacle. The crowd cheered as the fireworks reached their crescendo, forming a giant, sparkling portrait of Fred and George together in the air above them, young, mischievous, and full of the inventive spirit that had ultimately led to this moment. Chapter 10: The Man Behind the Curtain. 6 months after the spectacular anniversary celebration, George Weasley sat alone in his private workshop beneath the shop. The purple coat hung on its stand in the corner. The top hat rested beside it. Without his theatrical attire, George looked both younger and more tired, simply a man in his early 20s who had experienced too much too soon. Before him on the workbench lay an array of business documents, contracts for new Daydream Door locations, proposals for international expansion, and licensing agreements for authorized Weasley's Wizarding Wonders products. The small family joke shop had grown into an enterprise beyond anything he and Fred had envisioned during those early experiments in their bedroom at the Burrow. Success had brought new challenges. Managing the expanding business required more time in meetings and less in the inventing room. The Wonder Workers, once a small, tight-knit team, now numbered in the dozens across multiple locations. George found himself becoming what Fred would have teased him mercilessly for, a businessman. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. The door opened to reveal Ron, who had taken on increasing responsibilities within the company over the past year. "All the department heads are here for the quarterly meeting," Ron informed him. "They're waiting in the conference room." George nodded, reaching automatically for the purple coat before stopping himself. These meetings didn't require the showman. They required the director of a growing business empire. "Just me today, Ronnie," he said, straightening his ordinary robes. "Mr. Weasley, confectionery wizard extraordinaire, can take the afternoon off." Ron studied his brother with concern. Everything all right? George ran a hand through his hair, grown longer now, perhaps unconsciously to cover his missing ear, just thinking about what Fred would make of all this. Quarterly meetings, department heads, 5-year expansion plans. "He'd take the mickey out of you for at least a month," Ron said with a grin. "At minimum," George agreed, returning the smile. As they headed toward the conference room, they passed through the main shop floor. It was a Tuesday morning, relatively quiet compared to the weekend rushes, but still buzzing with activity. Wonder Workers guided customers through new displays. Children pressed their faces against glass cases, eyes wide with amazement at the magical treats within. The chocolate river flowed serenely around the perimeter. George paused, watching a young boy experiencing a weather willy for the first time. The child's expression of surprise and delight, as a tiny snow flurry manifested inside his mouth, was genuine wonder in its purest form. "That's what Fred would care about," George said quietly to Ron. "Not the business side, that part he'd find dead boring. But that," he nodded toward the delighted child, "that would make it all worthwhile for him." The quarterly meeting proceeded efficiently. Department heads reported on sales, development of new products, marketing initiatives, and expansion plans. The Daydream Doors had proven even more popular than anticipated, with long lines at every location and requests coming in from wizarding communities around the world. "We've had particular interest from Japan," reported Cho Chang, who had recently joined the company to manage international relations. "Their magical confectionery tradition is quite different from ours, and they're fascinated by our innovations. They're offering a very attractive partnership deal." George listened attentively, asking appropriate questions and making thoughtful decisions. To everyone in the room, he appeared every inch the successful business leader, focused, strategic, and visionary. Only Ron noticed the moments when George's fingers would drum restlessly on the table, or his gaze would drift toward the workshop door, signs of the inventor itching to escape the businessman. When the meeting concluded, George retreated to his office, another new addition necessitated by the growing enterprise. As the various department heads filed out, Ron lingered behind. "You know," he said, dropping into the chair across from George's desk, "you don't have to do all of this yourself." George looked up from the contracts he was already reviewing. "What do you mean?" "The business side," Ron clarified. "You've got people who can handle most of this now, good people who understand your vision, but no one can invent like you can." George sat back, considering his brother's words. "Are you suggesting I drop the boring parts and just play with sweets all day?" "Basically, yeah," Ron said with characteristic bluntness. Fred wouldn't have sat through half of that meeting without setting something on fire just to liven things up. The mention of Fred still brought a pang, but it was softer now, mellowed by time and purpose. "Probably true," George acknowledged with a small smile. "Look," Ron continued, "I'm not saying abandon the business entirely, but maybe delegate more. Let the people you've hired do their jobs while you focus on what you do best, creating impossible things and making people smile." George studied his younger brother with newfound appreciation. Ron had grown considerably since those early days at Hogwarts. The war and its aftermath had matured them all. "When did you get so insightful?" George asked. Ron's ears reddened slightly. "Hermione's rubbing off on me, I reckon. Don't tell her I said that." Later that evening, after the shop had closed, George found himself wandering the quiet floors of Weasley's Wizarding Wonders. He moved through the bubble room, where iridescent spheres floated peacefully in the dim light. He passed through the confoundery, now still and almost ordinary without customers experiencing its perception-altering treats. He rode the glass elevator to the Memorial Meadow, where the remembrance tree's crystalline leaves chimed softly in the night breeze. Everywhere he looked, he saw not just a successful business, but a living tribute to Fred, to joy, to the power of imagination to heal even the deepest wounds. Angelina found him there, sitting beneath the remembrance tree with his purple coat draped across his lap, running his fingers over the embroidered golden W's. "Thought I might find you up here," she said, settling beside him on the bench. "Rough day." George shook his head. "Not rough exactly, just contemplative. I spent 3 hours today discussing profit margins and expansion strategies. Fred would have hexed me for being such a bore." Angelina chuckled. "He might have hexed you, but he'd have been proud too. This place," she gestured around them, "it's extraordinary, George. It's changing how people think about magic, making it joyful again after so much darkness." "That's what I want," George admitted. "More than the success or the galleons. I want people to remember the wonder of magic, not just its power or its danger." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the gentle music of the tree. "I've been thinking," George said finally, "about stepping back from the day-to-day management, letting the teams run the business operations while I return to inventing full-time." "Sounds like a good idea," Angelina said. "Your eyes light up when you're creating something new, not so much when you're reviewing quarterly projections." George laughed. "That obvious, is it?" "To those who know you," she replied, taking his hand. He turned to face her, suddenly serious. "What I'm creating next. It's special, Aang, different from anything in the shop. I haven't told anyone about it yet, not even family." "Another door," she guessed. He shook his head. "Something more personal, something for us, not for the business." He hesitated, then asked, "Do you remember the Fainting Fancies, one of our first skiving snack boxes?" Angelina nodded, looking confused about the connection. "Fred and I created those when we were 15, George continued. "We hadn't even mastered nonverbal spells yet, but we were already developing products complex enough to temporarily alter physical states." He paused, a hint of the old mischievous glint in his eye. "Makes you wonder what we could have created if we'd applied ourselves to our actual schoolwork." "You wouldn't have been Fred and George if you had," Angelina pointed out. "True enough," George agreed. "The point is, magic has always come naturally to me. But since," he trailed off briefly, "since Fred's been gone, I've been pushing myself further, trying to create magic that matters more. The daydream doors were just the beginning." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, ornate box, not purple and gold like the shop's packaging, but a deep, warm red with intricate patterns that seemed to shift subtly in the moonlight. Over the past year, I've been working on a different kind of magic, he explained, turning the box in his hands. Not just enchantments or cleverly combined charms, but something deeper, a magic that connects rather than transforms. Angelina watched him curiously as he continued. You know how the memory sweets work, distilling emotions into edible form. George opened the box, revealing what appeared to be a pair of simple golden rings nestled inside. These operate on the same principle, but permanently and between two people. Angelina's eyes widened as she began to understand. George are those. Wedding bands, he confirmed, suddenly looking nervous in a way the confident shopkeeper rarely did. But not ordinary ones. They're connected to each other through something like the twin bond Fred and I shared, allowing emotions to flow between the wearers. Not in an intrusive way, he added hastily. Just awareness, comfort, connection. He lifted one of the rings, showing the intricate spellwork engraved on the inner surface. I've been developing them for months, testing the enchantments, making sure they're perfect, safe. Angelina seemed at a loss for words. Too much? George asked, uncertainty creeping into his voice. I know it's unusual, but after losing that twin connection so suddenly, I wanted to create something that would ensure we'd always be connected, no matter what happens. Angelina's expression softened as she understood the deeper meaning behind the invention. It wasn't just a romantic gesture. It was George's way of ensuring he would never again experience the severance of a profound connection without warning. They're beautiful, she said softly. Extraordinary. George looked relieved but still nervous. I should clarify that I'm not actually proposing right this second. That will come with proper planning and significantly more dramatic flair, as befits my reputation. His attempt at lightness couldn't quite hide the vulnerability beneath. I just wanted to show you what I've been working on, what's been most important to me. Angelina leaned forward and kissed him gently. I love you, George Weasley, purple coat or not, successful businessman or mad inventor. I love who you've become and who you're still becoming. George carefully returned the rings to their box, then reached up to touch one of the crystalline leaves on the remembrance tree. It chimed a single, clear note that seemed to hang in the air between them. I used to think I'd never be whole again without Fred, he admitted. Like I'd lost not just my twin, but half of myself. Opening the shop as Weasley's Wizarding Wonders was my way of moving forward while still honoring him. But somewhere along the way, I realized something important. What's that? Angelina asked. George smiled, and in that smile was both the mischievous boy he had been and the remarkable man he had become. That Fred wouldn't want me to be half of anything. He'd want me to be fully, completely George, whoever that turns out to be. The remembrance tree seemed to agree, its leaves creating a gentle melody that surrounded them with memories transformed into music, not diminished by time but enriched by it, like the finest chocolate developing deeper notes as it matures. Above them, the enchanted ceiling of the memorial meadow showed stars emerging one by one in the evening sky. Among them, George fancied he could see one that twinkled with particular brightness, winking at him perhaps, the way Fred used to do when they shared a private joke. George winked back, then turned to Angelina, the future bright before them.